September 24th, 2024, Yankee Stadium. A basketball player, a Knicks guard named Josh Hart, is standing in Monument Park, and somebody hands him a pinstriped jersey, number 32, and Hart holds it up, and you can see on his face that this is not just a photo opportunity. This is something else. This is a man standing in front of his family's name etched into a wall alongside Mantle and DiMaggio and Gehrig, and he is, I think the word is reckoning with the weight of it. The jersey belonged to his great-uncle, Elston Howard, and if that name does not immediately register, that itself is the problem I want to spend the next 40 minutes pulling apart. Because here's what happened when Hart mentioned the connection. The sports media did what sports media does. They wrote the 600-word version, first black Yankee, MVP in '63, invented the batting donut, died too young, end of story. Next segment. And I sat there reading these pieces and I thought, no, that is not the story. That is the Wikipedia entry. The story is something that I do not think has ever been properly told, and it starts not in the Bronx, not in St. Louis, where Elston was born, but in a restaurant kitchen in Memphis, Tennessee, that almost nobody alive today has ever heard of. I want to tell you about a woman named Maryland Augusta Howard, and I want to be honest with you about what we are doing here, because I think intellectual honesty matters more than clean narrative. What I'm about to walk you through is a reconstruction. It is built from family accounts, from the oral tradition that black families in the mid-20th century maintained, because, and this is something people forget, the written record was not designed to capture them. The census missed them. The newspapers ignored them. The institutions that document history were not, in the 1930s and 40s, particularly interested in documenting the interior lives of black women in the South. So what you get is fragments, journal entries, things that a nephew told his son, who one day threw a first pitch at Yankee Stadium. And what I have done, what I have spent, honestly, an unreasonable amount of time doing, is taking those fragments and setting them against what we do know. The dates, the places, the movements of people through geography and through history. And when you do that, when you lay the fragments against the verified record, something extraordinary starts to take shape. I had a former student. She runs a foundation now focused on oral history preservation in the Mississippi Delta. And she told me something once that I have never forgotten. She said, the most important histories are the ones that were never written down, because the people living them were too busy living them. They were too busy surviving, too busy building, too busy feeding people, literally feeding people, to stop and write a memoir. And the tragedy is that when those people die, the history goes with them unless someone in the family bothered to listen. Someone in the Hart family listened. So, Maryland Augusta Howard, she was Travis Howard's sister. Travis Howard was Elston's father. And Travis and Emmeline Hill, Emmeline was a nurse at a hospital in St. Louis. They had Elston in 1929 and then divorced when he was about 6 years old. That part is documented. What is less documented, what lives in the family record rather than the public one, is what happened to the boy during those fracture years. Where did he go when the household split? Who caught him? The answer, if you follow the family's account, is that for a period, and I want to be careful here, because the exact duration is not something I can pin with certainty, maybe a summer, maybe longer. Elston lived with his Aunt Maryland in Memphis, and the Memphis that Maryland occupied was not the Memphis of Beale Street tourist brochures. This was Memphis in the late 1930s, early 40s. Segregation was not a policy. It was the architecture of daily life. It was the air. And in that Memphis, Maryland Augusta Howard ran a place called the Brotherhood Cafe. Now, I need you to hold that name in your mind, the Brotherhood Cafe, because by the end of this lecture, you will understand why I believe that what happened inside that building, what was discussed, what was fed, what was imagined into existence, constitutes one of the most significant undocumented nodes in the story of Black American aspiration. And I use the word node deliberately, not institution, not movement, node, a point of connection through which energy and people and ideas passed, and out of which emerged individuals who changed the trajectory of things. This is not a story about baseball. I mean, it is. Elston Howard is in it. Josh Hart is the reason we are talking about it. But baseball is the frame. The painting is something much larger. The painting is about a woman who understood, decades before the research caught up to her, that human excellence is not an accident. It is a system. It is a set of inputs. It is food. It is knowledge. It is the refusal to let circumstance define the boundaries of what a person can become. And I am going to tell you, I probably should not put it this way in an academic setting, but I am going to Maryland Augusta. Howard may have been, pound for pound, one of the most brilliant people to live in the 20th century American South. And you have never heard her name. That gap between who she was and the fact that you have never heard of her, that gap is the lecture. Let's go. Let me tell you the version of Elston Howard that you already know, or that you think you know, because I need to establish the foundation before I start pulling bricks out of it. The standard narrative goes like this. Born in St. Louis, 1929, grew up in a segregated city, went to Vashon High School, which, and this detail matters, was one of the premier all-black high schools in the country at the time. The kid was a multi-sport athlete: football, basketball, baseball. Good enough that in 1948, when he was 19, he got scholarship offers from Illinois, from Michigan State. 25 offers, one source says. And he turned them all down to play professional baseball for $500 a month with the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro American League. Now, hold on. Let me sit with that for a second, because I think we skipped past it too quickly. A 19-year-old black man in 1948 turning down college scholarships, plural, from Big Ten schools, to play in the Negro Leagues. The financial calculus there is something that most people today just cannot wrap their heads around. $500 a month in 48 is, let me think, it is something like $5,000 or $6,000 in today's money, annually, maybe $40,000, against a college education that, for a black man in post-war America, carried, and this is the part that complicates the simple narrative, carried no guarantee of anything. A degree from Michigan in 1948 did not open the same doors for a black graduate that it opened for a white one. The calculus was genuinely different. But here is where the standard narrative gets lazy. It tells you that Howard chose baseball because he loved baseball. End of analysis. And I do not think that is sufficient, because the question that nobody asks is, who equipped this 19-year-old kid to make a decision like that? Who gave him the framework to evaluate 25 scholarship offers against a $500 a month contract and choose the contract? That is not a sports decision. That is a strategic decision. That is a decision made by someone who's been taught to think in systems, to think about trajectories rather than credentials. The textbook version of the story skips ahead. Howard plays 3 seasons with the Monarchs, rooms with Ernie Banks. The Yankees buy his contract in 1950. He goes into the Army for 2 years, comes back, tears up AAA ball in Toronto, hits .330 with 22 home runs, wins the league MVP, and on April 14th, 1955, 8 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Brooklyn, Elston Howard walks onto the field at Yankee Stadium and becomes the first black man to wear the pinstripes. Casey Stengel called him 8-ball. I want you to sit with that. The manager of the New York Yankees, the most storied franchise in American professional sports, referred to his first black player by a racial slur. And Howard, and this is what kills me about reading the biographical material, Howard was described as dignified, patient. He did not make waves. He accepted the backup role behind Yogi Berra. He accepted being moved to first base, to the outfield, wherever they needed him, without complaint. And the white press loved him for it. The word they used most often was class. Elston Howard had class. Okay, I want to step outside the narrative for a second, because something is bothering me, and I think it has been bothering me since I first started reading about Howard seriously, maybe. I think it was 2016 or 17 when a colleague forwarded me an article about Hart's connection. The thing that bothers me is the word patience, because we use that word as a compliment when we apply it to people like Elston Howard, but I think it disguises something structural. Patience implies choice. It implies that Howard could have been impatient and chose not to be. And maybe that is true. But I want to suggest another possibility. Maybe what we are calling patience was actually preparation. Maybe Howard walked into that clubhouse already equipped to manage that environment because someone had already taught him how to navigate spaces that were not built for him. Not through passivity, through comprehension, through understanding the architecture of the institutions he was entering in a way that allowed him to operate inside them without being destroyed by them. And that brings me back to Memphis, back to the Brotherhood Cafe, back to Maryland, because, and I realize I'm getting ahead of myself, but I want to plant this. The family's account suggests that what happened in that kitchen, what Maryland taught, was not just nutrition. It was not just food. It was a complete theory of how a black person could move through American institutions and extract from them what was needed without surrendering what mattered. That is, I'm still trying to find the right words for it, that is a technology. That is a social technology that was being transmitted through cornbread and conversation. Robert Putnam wrote about social capital, the value embedded in networks and relationships. And William Julius Wilson at Harvard spent a career mapping how the dissolution of black institutional networks in urban centers hollowed out the transmission mechanisms for exactly this kind of knowledge. But what Wilson described happening on the macro level, the disappearance of gathering places, of institutions that served as knowledge transfer nodes, was the mirror image of what the Brotherhood Cafe represented when it existed. It was a node that was operational, it was working. People came in not knowing things and left knowing them. I want to come back to that framework, but first let me finish the biographical timeline, because there is a number I need you to have. 1963. Howard hits .287, 28 home runs, 85 runs batted in, wins the Gold Glove, and becomes the first black player in American League history to win the Most Valuable Player award. 16 years after Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball, 16 years for a black man in the American League to win the MVP. The National League had given it to, let me think, Campanella, Mays, Banks, Frank Robinson. The American League had not. And here is the detail that gets omitted from the clean narrative. One of the reasons is that the American League was slower to integrate. The Yankees were one of the last teams to put a black player on the field, and the league's culture reflected that delay. So when Howard won that MVP in '63, it was not just individual achievement, it was a data point about institutional resistance and the cost of overcoming it. And the question I keep returning to is, what was the engine? What was the structural thing underneath Elston Howard that made him capable of absorbing that cost for that long? The standard biography says character. I think that is a word people use when they do not want to investigate further. I think the answer is the Brotherhood Cafe. Memphis in the 1940s and 50s was a city that operated on two frequencies simultaneously. There was the public frequency, the one the newspapers covered, the one that existed in the official record. White Memphis, cotton money, machine politics, Boss Crump's Memphis, for those of you who know that reference. Edward Crump ran that city like a personal franchise from roughly 1910 through the late 40s. And the racial order was not subtle. It was explicit. Segregation was not a set of informal customs. It was law. It was zoning. It was where you could walk and where you could not, where you could eat and where you would be arrested for trying. And then there was the second frequency, Black Memphis. Beale Street, yes, but more than Beale Street. There was an entire parallel infrastructure that white Memphis did not see and did not want to see. Churches that functioned as banks, barbershops that functioned as newsrooms, and restaurants that functioned as, I want to find a word that is more precise than meeting place. Incubators, that is closer. Spaces where the intellectual life of Black Memphis was not just maintained, but actively expanded. The Brotherhood Cafe was one of these spaces, Maryland, Augusta. Howard opened it, and the exact date is not something I can establish with the kind of precision that would satisfy a footnote in an academic journal, but the family's account places it in the late 1940s, in a part of Memphis, where black-owned businesses clustered for mutual protection. The name itself tells you something. Brotherhood. Not in the labor union sense, though that resonance was probably intentional. Brotherhood as in the assertion of a shared project. The assertion that black people in Memphis were not simply enduring segregation, they were building something inside it. Now, I need to take a detour here because I think the default way people think about black life under segregation is fundamentally distorted, and if I do not correct it, the rest of what I want to say about Maryland will not land correctly. The default narrative, the one that most of us absorb without really examining it, frames black communities under segregation as communities defined by what they lacked. Lacking access, lacking resources, lacking opportunity. And all of that is true. Segregation was a system of deprivation, but, and this is something that scholars like Noliwe Rooks at Brown and Devarian Baldwin at Trinity have written about with real precision, the deprivation narrative erases the agency narrative. It erases the fact that inside the constraints, there was creation. There was invention. There was a kind of ruthless pragmatic genius that figured out how to build institutions, build wealth, build knowledge networks with the materials available, not despite the constraints within them. Maryland, Augusta, Howard was a product of that genius and a practitioner of it. The family's account describes a woman who taught herself to read, which in rural Missouri in the early 20th century for a black woman was not a given, and then did not stop at reading. She taught herself mathematics. She taught herself what the family describes as natural science, which I take to mean a kind of autodidactic blend of nutrition, botany, animal husbandry, the practical sciences that a person running a food business would need. And she taught herself something that I think is the most interesting part of her intellectual profile. She studied, on her own, through whatever books she could get access to, the relationship between food and human performance. Let me be specific about what that means, because it sounds generic, and it is not. In the 1940s and 50s, sports nutrition did not exist as a field. The first serious academic work on the relationship between diet and athletic performance did not appear until, I'm trying to remember, I think the Scandinavian glycogen studies were in the late 60s, 67 maybe. So what Maryland was doing in her kitchen in Memphis in the 40s and 50s was working from first principles. She was observing what foods produced, what effects in the people she fed. She was running, in essence, an informal empirical program in a restaurant kitchen with no institutional support, no published literature, no framework other than her own observation and her own relentless curiosity. And the person she tested her theories on most directly, at least during the periods when he was in Memphis, was her nephew Elston. I had dinner once with a nutritionist who consults for, I should not name the team, but it is an NFL franchise, one of the ones that has been good for a long time. And she told me something that stuck with me. She said, the biggest shift in sports performance in the last 30 years has not been in training methods or in equipment or in analytics. It has been in the understanding that what you eat is not fuel, it is information. Food is a signaling mechanism. It tells your body what to build, what to repair, what to prioritize. And I sat there thinking about Maryland Howard in her Memphis kitchen in 1940-something, and I thought, she knew that. She did not have the vocabulary, she did not have the biochemistry. But the practice was there. The family describes meals that Maryland prepared for Elston that emphasized protein density, lean protein, low carbohydrate intake to keep him lean and fast. And when he was playing, when he was practicing or in games, she would prepare specific carbohydrate-rich foods for energy and pair them with protein for recovery. This is, in rough form, the periodization of macronutrient intake that elite sports nutrition programs use today. She was doing it with cast iron skillets and whatever the local market had available. But the Brotherhood Cafe was not just a nutrition laboratory. It was, and this is the part that I think elevates it from interesting family history to something structurally significant, a place where conversations happened that were decades ahead of the national discourse. The family's account places Martin Luther King Jr. in the Brotherhood Cafe. Now, King's connection to Memphis is well documented. He was there for the sanitation workers' strike in '68, which is where he was killed. But his presence in Memphis extended further back than that final visit. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference had organizational ties throughout Tennessee. And Memphis, as a major black cultural and economic center in the Mid-South, was a natural node in the civil rights network. What the family describes happening in those conversations, and again, I am working from accounts that passed through generations, so I am holding this with appropriate caution, is that the discussion at the Brotherhood Cafe was not limited to the access question, not limited to desegregation. Maryland was pushing something different. She was asking, and this is the phrase that the family uses, how can Black America engineer a new economic category? Stay with me here, because this phrase, if it is even approximately accurate, is extraordinary for its time. The mainstream civil rights discourse in the 1950s was focused on access to public spaces, access to the ballot, access to education, and those were the right fights. I'm not questioning that. But what Maryland was apparently discussing, over meals she prepared herself, in a restaurant she owned, in a building she controlled, was something adjacent to, but different from access. She was talking about creation, about building systems, about what we would today call black entrepreneurship infrastructure, or what, in contemporary language, you might call venture incubation. She was, according to the family's account, providing free meals to organizers and thinkers and community leaders, not as charity, as investment. The Brotherhood Cafe was her platform, and the meals were her way of creating a space where ideas could develop without the friction of scarcity. If you were doing important work, organizing, teaching, building, you could eat at the Brotherhood Cafe. That was the deal. Not stated, understood. I want to give that a name because I think it deserves one. I am going to call it the nourishment as infrastructure model. The idea that feeding people is not a service industry act. It is a foundational act of institution building. You create a physical space. You remove the survival anxiety, hunger, from the equation. And then you let the people you have gathered do the intellectual and organizational work that hunger would otherwise prevent. This model has parallels. The Black Panther breakfast programs in the late 60s, the settlement houses of the Progressive era, the monastic traditions of medieval Europe, where religious communities provided food and shelter as the substrate for intellectual work. But Maryland was doing it alone, with one restaurant, in Memphis, under segregation. And the thing about it that I keep coming back to, the thing that honestly keeps me up, is that she was not famous for it. She was not trying to be famous for it. There is no archive. There is no institution bearing her name. There is a family that remembers, and a basketball player who mentioned his uncle's name, and a chain of connections that leads back to a kitchen. Let me build this from the ground up, because I want to make the mechanism legible to anyone. If you are a high school student watching this at 2 a.m. because the algorithm put it in front of you, I want you to track every step. The surface mechanism is this. Elston Howard did not just arrive at Yankee Stadium in 1955 as a finished product. Nobody does. The question that scouts and coaches and general managers ask about any athlete is, where did the foundation come from? And for most elite athletes, the answer is some combination of genetics, early coaching, institutional support, and environment. Some kid gets lucky with a little league coach who actually knows what they're doing. Some kid gets into an elite travel ball program. Some kid has parents who can afford the camps and the equipment and the windshield time. Driving between tournaments, Elston Howard had none of that. What Elston Howard had was Vashon High School in St. Louis and an aunt in Memphis with a restaurant. So let me walk through how the mechanism actually worked. When Elston's parents divorced, Travis and Emmeline, around 1935, Elston about 6 years old, the family network absorbed the disruption. That is how black families in the pre-war South operated. The nuclear family fractures, the extended family catches. Emmeline remarried. Elston stayed in St. Louis most of the time. But there were periods, summers, possibly longer, when he was in Memphis with Maryland. And what Maryland did during those periods was not babysitting, it was programming. That is the word I want to use, and I mean it in the system sense. She was programming the boys' inputs. Start with food. I talked about the nutrition piece already, but let me get more granular because the specifics matter. The family describes Maryland's approach to feeding Elston as deliberate in a way that went beyond just making sure he ate well. She tracked, not with spreadsheets obviously, but with the observational rigor of someone who pays very close attention, she tracked the relationship between what he ate and how he performed. If he ate a heavy meal of starches and then tried to practice, she noticed that he was sluggish. She adjusted, more lean protein, greens, foods that she believed, and again, she had no published science to draw on, would keep his body lean and responsive rather than heavy and slow. Think about the context. This is the 1940s. The standard American diet for a black family in the South was built around what was available and affordable. Cornbread, beans, fatback. These are calorie-dense, nutrient-variable foods that sustained a working population, but were not optimized for athletic performance. What Maryland was doing was, within the constraints of what she could access and afford, shifting the nutritional composition of Elston's diet toward what she intuitively understood would produce a different kind of body, a body built for speed and endurance rather than just survival. Now, and this is where I have to be careful because I do not want to overstate the claim, I am not saying that Maryland's cooking is the reason Elston Howard became a Hall of Fame caliber player. Genetics played a role, talent played a role, Vashon High School played a role, but I am saying that the nutritional foundation she laid was a meaningful variable, and it is a variable that the standard biography completely ignores. The biography says he was talented. The biography says he worked hard. The biography does not say that someone spent years engineering his dietary inputs to optimize his physical development, and food was only the first layer. The second layer was intellectual. Maryland did not just feed Elston's body, she fed his mind. The family describes a woman who pushed education with, and I want to get the flavor of this right, with an intensity that bordered on relentless. She pushed her own daughter, Travestine, the same way. Travestine Barton was 8 years younger than Elston, and from what the family says, Maryland gave her the full curriculum. Mathematics, music, reading. Not just reading as literacy, but reading as a way of building a mental model of the world. The idea was not assimilation. Maryland was apparently quite specific about this. The idea was comprehension, understanding how the world operated so that you could move through it on your own terms. This distinction matters. There's a difference between teaching a child to fit in and teaching a child to understand. Fitting in requires adaptation. Understanding requires analysis. And analysis, unlike adaptation, is portable. You can carry it from one context to another. A person who has been taught to adapt to a specific environment is lost when the environment changes. A person who has been taught to understand environments can navigate any of them. I think this is what Maryland was transmitting, not a curriculum, a cognitive operating system, a way of processing the world that was independent of the specific circumstances you found yourself in. And I think, though I am speculating here and I want to be transparent about that, I think this is what allowed Elston Howard to walk into the most hostile clubhouse in baseball, absorb the racial slurs from his own manager, and operate at an elite level for 14 years without being destroyed by the environment. Because he understood the environment. He was not enduring it blindly. He was reading it. He was processing it through a framework that Maryland had built in him, piece by piece, meal by meal, conversation by conversation, in a restaurant in Memphis. Let me tell you about Travestine Barton because her trajectory reinforces the mechanism. Maryland's daughter, 8 years younger than Elston, which puts her birth around 1937. The family's account says that Travestine became one of the first black women to attend the University of Michigan. Now, I want to be precise about this. Michigan admitted black students before the Civil War. It was one of the more progressive institutions, but the number of black women enrolled in the 40s and 50s was vanishingly small. So when I say one of the first, I mean she was operating in an environment where she could count the number of people who looked like her in a lecture hall on one hand, maybe fewer, and she went there. She went to Ann Arbor from Memphis, from the Brotherhood Cafe to the halls of one of the premier public universities in the country. And the family attributes that trajectory directly to Maryland's influence, directly to the cognitive operating system, directly to the idea that comprehension, not adaptation, was the way through. I called it the cognitive architecture transfer earlier in my notes, and I want to refine that now. What Maryland was doing was building what I would call a transferable excellence framework. The insight is that excellence in any domain, sports, academics, entrepreneurship, navigation of hostile institutions, draws on a common underlying structure, and that structure can be transmitted, not through genetics, not through wealth, through the painstaking, daily, relentless work of teaching a young person how to think. This is, by the way, what elite prep schools have always done. Andover, Exeter, the Dalton School. The secret of those institutions is not the textbooks. It is not even the teachers, though the teachers are good. The secret is the cognitive operating system they install, the way of processing information, evaluating arguments, making decisions under uncertainty. And Maryland was running her own version of that program. In a restaurant, with no institutional backing, no endowment, no board of trustees, just her own mind and her own kitchen and her own ferocious belief that the people she loved could be extraordinary if they were given the right inputs. There is something in that image, a black woman in Memphis in the 40s running what amounts to a one-person elite education program out of a restaurant that I find almost unbearably powerful. And I think the reason it is powerful is precisely because it is invisible. It happened outside every system designed to recognize and reward it. It happened in the margins and the outputs. An MVP catcher, a Michigan-educated daughter, a family whose name ends up on the wall of Yankee Stadium 3 generations later. Those outputs are visible. But the mechanism that produced them, that was hidden. That was the Brotherhood Cafe. That was Maryland. The hidden wiring of the Brotherhood Cafe was economic imagination. Let me define what I mean by that, because I do not mean it in the way an economics textbook would. Economic imagination is the capacity to envision an economic structure that does not yet exist and then behave as if it will. It is the ability to think about wealth creation, about enterprise, about the flow of resources and capital, not within the framework that currently exists, but within a framework that you are in the process of building. And this, if the family's account is even approximately accurate, is what Maryland was doing at the Brotherhood Cafe. She was not just running a restaurant. She was not just feeding civil rights workers. She was modeling something. She was demonstrating, through the daily operation of her business, that a black woman could own an enterprise, control a space, set the terms of exchange, and use that enterprise as a platform for something larger than profit. I keep thinking about a conversation I had years ago with a guy who ran, he is retired now, a small private equity fund focused on minority-owned businesses. And he said something that I wrote down on a napkin and still have somewhere. He said the biggest obstacle to black entrepreneurship in America was never capital. It was imagination. He said you cannot build what you cannot envision. And the systems that shape how people envision economic possibility, schools, media, family structures, community institutions, those systems, for black Americans, were systematically distorted by segregation. Not just access to capital, access to the idea of what was possible. Maryland had that idea. That is what the family's account is pointing at. She had the idea that black people could not just participate in the American economy. They could build new categories within it. She talked about incubation. That is the family's word, incubation. Before there was a venture capital industry, before there was a Silicon Valley, before the concept of an incubator or an accelerator had entered the mainstream business vocabulary. She was thinking about how you take a community's latent talent and create the conditions for it to produce enterprises. Now, I am going to complicate my own argument because I think that is important. There is a risk here of romanticizing, of turning Maryland Augusta Howard into a mythic figure and losing the specificity that makes her story meaningful. She was not a saint. She was not superhuman. She was a black woman in the Jim Crow South who ran a restaurant and had ideas. The ideas were big, but the execution was constrained by the same forces that constrained every black person in mid-century Memphis. She could not get a business loan from a white bank. She could not advertise in the white newspapers. Her customer base was limited by the same segregation that she was trying to think beyond. And her ideas, the economic imagination I am describing, did not fully materialize in her lifetime, at least not in the way she apparently envisioned. The Brotherhood Cafe did not become a chain. It did not become a foundation. It existed, it served its community, and at some point it was gone. The way so many black institutions in the mid-20th century were gone. Urban renewal demolished them, highway construction bisected them, the Great Migration drained the population bases that sustained them, and the oral histories that documented their existence faded as the generations that remembered them died. So, am I overstating the case? Maybe. I am honest about that. But I want to push back on my own doubt with a different metric. What if the measure of Maryland Augusta Howard's impact is not the Brotherhood Cafe itself, but the people who passed through it? What if the output metric is not institutional survival, but human trajectory? Because by that measure, the measure of what happened to the people she touched, the Brotherhood Cafe was one of the most successful incubators of the 20th century. Elston Howard, first black Yankee, American League MVP, 9-time All-Star, first black coach in the American League. His number retired alongside Ruth, Gehrig, Mantle, DiMaggio, dead at 51 from a rare heart disease. But in those 51 years, he broke barriers that the institution he played for had deliberately maintained for decades. And the question that the standard biography never asks: where did the structural capacity to do that come from? The family answers with a kitchen in Memphis. Travestine Barton, later Travestine Moore, one of the first black women at the University of Michigan. The family says she carried Maryland's intellectual framework into the academy and used it, and that is its own thread, its own conversation, that I am not sure I have time to fully pull today. But the trajectory speaks, from Memphis to Ann Arbor, from the Brotherhood Cafe to the halls of higher education, same operating system, different domain, and then, generations later, Josh Hart, standing in Monument Park, holding a jersey, and you watch the video of that moment and you think it is about baseball. You think it is about a basketball player paying tribute to his uncle, but it is not. Or rather, it is that. And it is also a wave propagating forward through time from a restaurant kitchen in Memphis to the pitcher's mound at Yankee Stadium in 2024. 80 years, 4 generations, and the wave is still moving. I want to tell you something that I think is the load-bearing observation of this entire lecture, and it is this. The most consequential acts of institution building in Black American history were often invisible. They happened in kitchens and barbershops and church basements. They were performed by people, overwhelmingly by women, who had no titles, no credentials, no platforms, and no interest in being recognized. They just did the work. They fed people. They taught children. They held spaces open so that the people inside them could become what the world outside told them they could not be. And the tragedy, or maybe not the tragedy, maybe the structural feature of this kind of work is that it is by nature undocumented. It does not produce publications. It does not produce press coverage. It produces people. It produces Elston Howards and Travestine Bartons and eventually Josh Harts. But the mechanism is invisible. The mechanism is the woman nobody wrote about. I started this lecture with a basketball player at Yankee Stadium. I want to end it somewhere different. I want to end it in a kitchen. It is Memphis. It is maybe 1943, 44, something like that. The war is on. The Brotherhood Cafe is open. And there is a 12 or 13-year-old boy sitting at a table, and his aunt is putting a plate in front of him. The plate is not random. She has thought about what is on it. She has thought about what his body needs and what his mind needs and what his future, which she can somehow envision even though nothing in her present circumstances would justify that vision, is going to demand of him. And she sits down across from him and she says, I am imagining now, I am filling in the silence that the historical record leaves. She says something like, do not just eat it, understand it. Understand why I made it this way. Understand that everything is a system, and if you understand the system, you can operate inside any structure they put in front of you. And the boy eats. And 20 years later, he is the most valuable player in the American League. And 40 years after that, he has a plaque on a wall. And 80 years after that, his grandnephew holds up a jersey and an entire stadium cheers for a name, and nobody cheers for the woman who made the plate. So let me, right now, in whatever small way this reaches, Maryland, Augusta Howard, the Brotherhood Cafe, Memphis, Tennessee. The architecture was always there. We just were not looking in the right room.